So, why do we switch sides in debate? Well, partly it's pedagogical to learn both sides of the argument, but also it's partly due to the structure of debate. So, when most people approach an argument that they're in, generally what they think is happening is that they are presenting facts and someone else is presenting opinions. And this is kind of how we think of most arguments, is that it's trying to get someone to realize that our facts are true, and that's sort of how you win the argument. But remember, in debate, you're arguing for a theoretically neutral third party, the judge. You're not actually trying to convince the other person. So it's not so much you want facts or opinions, you want a mix of things that are going to be as persuasive as possible to the judge. So one of the kind of common criticisms of switch side debate is that it eliminates conviction. And the idea is that there should be things that you kind of firmly believe in, and that you shouldn't just sort of, role play as someone on the other side or play devil's advocate, that those are bad for your kind of either intellectual or moral development. So let's start there. Does debate force me to argue things that I don't believe in? No, it doesn't, as long as you're creative. So let's say that you are firmly against the death penalty, because that's the AF that we're going to talk about. Do you have to, in debates, argue that the death penalty is good? Technically, no. Even if you debate another person or team and they say that their affirmative is that the death penalty is bad, that doesn't necessarily mean you need to defend the death penalty. You could read like an agent or process counterplan. You could read a critique or topicality. Those are all arguments that you could argue against the affirmative that wouldn't require you to defend the actual death penalty, the policy that you oppose, but would still allow you to disagree and argue against the affirmative. And that's sort of the structural condition of debate, is that you can't agree after the other team stakes out a position. You can agree with parts of the things they say. Like if they say we should end fossil fuel subsidies to solve global warming, you can agree that global warming is bad, but disagree that ending fossil fuel subsidies is the way to solve global warming. But you can't agree with everything. You can't just stand up in your 1 and C and be like, I agree, and sit down. The other thing in debate that forces you to argue against your beliefs possibly is that you have to switch sides. So not only can you not agree, but you have to defend both sides of the issue. So round one, you could argue the death penalty is bad. Round two, if the other team says that, you're put in a position of arguing that the death penalty is good. So debate never really forces you to take any specific position, but it does force you to kind of switch sides and think about things from both angles. So if you have to argue against the death penalty, or I'm sorry, if you have to argue against abolishing the death penalty, you want to know what the best negative arguments are. If you only know the bad ones like deterrence, then you're not going to be very successful. This part of debate is sort of premised on the town hall model. So there was an article written about this a couple years ago that used the following example. So in the debate about universal health care, there's a lot of arguments that people make for why we should have universal health care. Not all of those arguments are consistent. So for example, some people say we should have universal health care because there's something like 30 million people who are poor and primarily people of color who don't have access to health care, and universal health care would fix that problem. But there are also white nationalists who argue for universal health care because they think that once we have a universal health care system, the cost of providing health care to undocumented immigrants would be so high that it would turn the country against immigration. That's essentially their strategy, is to use universal health care to get people to become more xenophobic. Now, if you were to go to a town hall and the subject of debate was whether or not we should have universal health care, you could present your justification for helping poor people and minorities, and the other side could say, we agree with universal health care, but for racist reasons. So in a town hall where anyone can say anything, the idea is that not everyone on the side of universal health care is responsible for all the justifications presented for universal health care. So even if you think many of the arguments for the death penalty, like deterrence, are bad, just because you argue against abolishing the death penalty doesn't mean that you necessarily endorse all of the bad or problematic reasons why the death penalty might be a good idea. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that even if you quote unquote switch sides, it doesn't necessarily mean you're 100% switching. You may be switching from the death penalty is bad to the death penalty is good, but that doesn't mean that you have to argue that everything that has affirmative said about the death penalty is in fact good. So if the affirmative is like the death penalty gets used against innocent people, switching sides doesn't mean you have to say it's good to kill innocent people. Like that would obviously be preposterous. It just means you're switching sides on the policy. And so that may seem like a trivial distinction, but obviously there could be a lot of justifications, a huge range for every policy, even policies that you agree with. And you probably don't agree with all of those justifications, even though you agree with some of them. So remember, we're not saying that you have to switch sides on literally everything. We're saying you have to switch sides on the policy. And when you do that, you don't have to present every argument if you don't want to. You can be creative in order to avoid it. So even though you don't have to switch sides, we do think that in debate generally there are some pedagogical benefits to switching sides. So the first is just sort of be prepared. So this is a list of arguments that have actually been run and have won debates before. So tobacco is good for you. That one's not super common now, but there was a time when there was all kinds of evidence, just like the evidence for global warming being good, that came from the tobacco industry that said that tobacco had all of these health benefits. Ditto air pollution. There's people who read cards that say air pollution is good because it stops UV radiation from giving you cancer, for example. Human extinction saves the universe. That's an argument called wipeout that says that humanity is sort of a rapacious virus that just spreads and destroys everywhere we go, and that there's potentially valuable life on other galaxies, and so we should end human life before we destroy the universe, essentially. That's an argument that people read every year, both Lincoln Douglas and Policy. We're living in a simulation, so this used to be pretty radical and fringe, but now, people like Elon Musk have tweeted about this. So that may seem like a pretty silly argument, but you are going to have a hard time beating the argument that we're in a simulation if you don't know about that argument, because it's not kind of a Reddit conspiracy theory. It's like a complex math physics argument about the probability that if it's possible to create an alternate universe with so many planets in the universe, that statistically it's very likely that someone has created a simulation. And so if you just kind of knew of that argument as a meme and didn't really know that it's an actual mathematical model proposed by like serious academics with PhDs, you're going to lose to the we live in a simulation thing. So part of knowing both sides of an issue is being prepared so that you don't like run into the buzzsaw of losing to bad arguments in the future. The second reason you want to investigate both sides is you want to be strategic. So let's say you're running the death penalty affirmative. You could have maybe like 5 or 6 different 1AC advantages that you could pick from in any given debate. If you know which set of negative arguments the other team is going to read, then you will not only know how to respond to them, but you'll also know which versions of your 1AC would provide the best arguments for that. So let's say you know that the negative is going to go for the argument that the death penalty deters. Well, deterrence is based on a set of rational calculations. So you'd want to try and read 1AC arguments and advantages that pointed out that the death penalty is not rational, that criminals don't behave in a rational manner. Whereas instead, if the negative was going to make an argument that's like the death penalty assuages the public's fear of crime and that prevents a harder police crackdown, well, that's not a rational belief system, right? Like there's no evidence that the death penalty reduces crime. So when people are afraid of crime, that's not rational. So there you need to read a different set of affirmative arguments and advantages about how abolishing the death penalty would change public perception of crime. And those arguments may not rely on rational choice theory either. So that's sort of in the broad strokes why you need to think about and be ready to debate both sides. Now I want to give you sort of a topic example in terms of criminal justice reform for how this is the case. And the way I want to do this is I want to look at different theories of punishment, like different theories of why we have the criminal justice system and why it might do the things it does, and then point out how you need to know about these side of, similarly to the arguments we talked about before, mutually exclusive theories of punishment. So the kind of oldest theory of punishment is retribution. Retribution literally means a system of criminal justice based on the punishment of offenders rather than on rehabilitation. Okay, so retributive we think of as like punishment, but it's not just punishment, it's also in place of rehabilitation. And so what does that mean, in place of rehabilitation? Well, a retributive theory of punishment is rooted in a specific belief about human nature. Okay, people who believe in retributive justice think that crime is something that's inherent to a person's nature. Okay, if someone is a quote bad person, if they commit crimes, it's because there's something bad in their nature that can't be changed. So rehabilitation is the attempt to change someone. And so if you assume that human nature is such that some people are just fundamentally fundamentally criminals, then they can't be rehabilitated. The only thing that you can do is punish them. Okay, so retributive punishment relies on a theory of human nature that says some people are good and some people are bad. Rehabilitation is the opposite of that. It focuses on the perpetrator as a patient or client to fix. Okay, so people who believe in rehabilitation don't think crime is nature. They think it's nurture, that you grow up in economic deprivation, that you come from a community that's been psychologically traumatized by decades of abuse, and that those are things that cause you to commit crime. So if it's the environment, if it's the conditions in which you find yourself that are causing crime, then a rehabilitative theory of punishment says the way to solve that is to address community problems. Okay, so like the defund police and invest in communities is fundamentally a rehabilitative approach. It says these people who are committing crimes aren't fundamentally different or bad. It's their environment that causes them to be put in a position where crime is their only option. So obviously, these two theories of justice so far take mutually exclusive views on human nature. One says it's entirely nurture, one says it's entirely nature. And which one of those things you believe in would determine which theory of punishment you believed in. But there's also a third option, rational choice theory. So rational choice theory basically says that everything you do, what you decide to eat for breakfast, whether or not you decide to study or do your homework, what kind of jobs you pursue, that all of those are basically rational cost benefit assessments where each person is trying to figure out where they can get the most utility. Utility is like value, basically. So in economics, which is where rational choice theory comes from, utility is just generally money, like what maximizes your financial well-being. But obviously, in the world, there are different forms of well-being. So, like you may do something that costs you a little bit of money now, but earns you a bunch of prestige. So, rational choice theory doesn't necessarily say crime is entirely economic, although there are people who will say that. But essentially, what rational choice theory would say is, to take an economic example, if you earn $50,000 a year and you have the possibility to commit a crime that's going to earn you $1 million, and the sentence for that crime is only 5 years, then economically it makes sense for you to commit that crime because in 5 years you'd only make $250,000. So you're making way more money committing that crime than you would otherwise. So the risk of prison may seem worth it to someone according to that rational cost assessment. So this just became a K lecture. Okay, what we're understanding here is that the way we frame the problem of crime determines the range of solutions we consider. Okay, and that's the basic premise of every representations critique. So someone says China is a currency manipulator and we should sanction them. What the China threat case says is it says threatening China or sanctioning them only makes sense if we have this view of China as a hostile actor that can't be negotiated with, and that if we didn't have that view, we would consider more policy options. Well, similarly, if you think human nature is inherently bad, you're never going to consider rehabilitative justice because you can't reform someone who's inherently, immoral. And so we generally think of like the view of human nature as being bad as a religious doctrine, sort of like a Christian conception of original sin is definitely one place where this comes from. But it's not just religion that propagates the belief that people are fundamentally bad. That's a belief that's in a whole bunch of different belief systems that, the goal of humanity is to kind of move away from our more base or animal nature. So we kind of think of that as a religious notion, but there's plenty of people who write about criminal justice who are like evolutionary psychologists, who are quote unquote scientists who don't believe in God or religion, and they still say the exact same arguments. So essentially you have two very different groups of people, evolutionary biologists who are like academics and then people who are conservative Christians, but they're coming to the same policy conclusion that because human nature is evil, we need a retributive system of justice. Okay, so the way we think about problems and how we conceive of them determines what kind of solutions that we'll look at. And so if that's the case, then we need to ask questions about these systems of justice and figure out how actually true are they, because if they're not true, then they shouldn't be constraining the outcomes we consider. So, for example, a retributive justice model would say rehabilitation is impossible. Almost every scientific study of rehabilitation disproves this. Okay, even if rehabilitation is not 100% effective, it's always more effective for a wide range of crimes than retributive punishment is. So, is rehabilitation impossible? No, it's definitely not. But is rehabilitation possible? Is the other end true? Is rehabilitation always possible? Well, no, we know that that's not true either. So these are kind of older statistics because, as you found researching prison statistics, it can be a little bit difficult to get timely information. But essentially, there's been pretty consistent data over time that a lot of people who commit crimes become repeat offenders. That's called recidivism, the idea that you're going to commit crimes again. Now, people who argue in favor of rehabilitation would say, well, the reason they committed more crimes is because the prison system is set up to punish them. And so obviously this isn't a clear cut, but what I'm trying to say is that it's complicated. There are some crimes for which rehabilitation works, some for which it doesn't. There are some instances in which punishment may work, some instances in which punishment may not work. And kind of similarly, all crime isn't necessarily rational. So the murder system already recognizes first and second degree murder as being different. If you premeditate and plan out a crime, that's treated more harshly than if you act in the heat of passion, for example. So our criminal justice system right now is not really purely rational, purely retributive, or purely rehabilitative. It's a mix of those things. So on this topic, what we're essentially debating is what would be a better mix. Okay, so theories of crime, like sort of arguments, can be mutually exclusive and not always agree. So in every debate, it might seem odd, but you might want to start with what does the affirmative think the status quo's theory of crime and punishment is, and what do they change it to? And if you can think that way, then you can attack one or the other. You can either defend the status quo or attack their model, and you don't necessarily need to switch sides on everything and say the death penalty is good, then say it's bad, then say it's good again.